Hey, well, actually, our energy is from Volcano Coffee.
All right.
Everybody's been drinking it this morning.
I think we need a better round of applause than that for the two people that just walked on stage.
Let's
with me.
give it up!
Thank you. That's better.
Let's hear it for the audience.
And now we're talking.
Abu Dhabi, let's get some noise.
Let's go.
Bitcoin going to 1 million.
So I had this legal pad with some
mic.
questions here, and I've decided to at least mentally rip it up if Max doesn't officially rip it up for me. But let's dive in with the question here. We're talking about El Salvador, the first Bitcoin country, in part thanks to the work that Stacy and Max have done. So can we talk a little bit about what the first mover advantage El Salvador now has? We have the U.S. talking about strategic Bitcoin reserves, other countries around the world looking into this, but El Salvador's been on this train. They were on the train first. What does that mean?
Well, El Salvador is the first mover, and that means we are the leader. And that is something very new to El Salvador, which had 40, 50 years of bad times when they were the only thing they led in was homicides. Now they are known as a leader in something that is transforming not only El Salvador, but the entire world. The entire UAE is talking about Bitcoin. The United States of America is talking about Bitcoin. Russia is talking about Bitcoin. Everybody's talking about Bitcoin. But when any news covers these transitions into a Bitcoin strategic reserve in those countries, they must refer to El Salvador. So that is such a mind shift in the world of looking at El Salvador. For us, this is a very powerful soft power.
The center of global freedom for many years was the United States, and people yearned to breathe free, as it says on the Statue of Liberty. Well, the new Statue of Liberty now is a volcano in El Salvador. And the mindset that informed Americans into building the 20th century powerhouse that was the United States are now in El Salvador. And El Salvador is now the global leader in economic freedom, freedom of expression, and we see it reflected in the faces of the people who are optimistic and happy. And that's all due to the combination of Bitcoin plus Bukele, who is, as Stacy says, a Renaissance man, a once-in-500-year leader. And the results are palpable. The results are obvious.
A question to you, Max. I have a question. So you were talking about $100,000 Bitcoin when Bitcoin was $1 many, many moons ago. Did you ever imagine that you'd be in the first nation state to adopt it when Bitcoin hit $100,000 as it did just a week ago?
What?
Did you? I said you were talking about $100,000 Bitcoin when Bitcoin was $1. You were predicting that one day Bitcoin would be at $100,000. Did you imagine that you'd be in a Bitcoin nation state, a state that had adopted it when Bitcoin hit $100,000?
Right. Well, on Keiser report, we speculated a few times with old G's like Trace Mayer and Tour de Meester, and we would discuss what nation state would be first in adopting Bitcoin, making it legal tender. El Salvador at that time, 5, 6, 7 years ago, was not mentioned, so it was a surprise when El Salvador was mentioned. And the fact that it's now 100,000 and going much higher, of course, it is fantastic for El Salvador.
Over to you, Stacy. You started the first national Bitcoin office, the first country to do something like this. You've done absolutely amazing work, which we'll get into in just a second. Are other countries not only going to copy Bitcoin, El Salvador stacking Bitcoin, 1 Bitcoin a day, but are they going to copy having an actual government office that handles Bitcoin affairs for the country?
Well, we already see President Trump starting to form a sort of crypto council, not a Bitcoin office. But, it's important to stress that with the Bitcoin office and Bitcoin policy, this falls under President Bukele's policy of economic liberty. So you had economic liberty first, and then Bitcoin legal tender and Bitcoin policy. So it falls within that, and I found it quite interesting that the most important business school in Europe, INSEAD, published a case study in successful rebranding. Obviously, they normally look at businesses, but El Salvador is kind of like the UAE in terms of being a city-state size. It's 6.5 million people live there. So Bitcoin policy falls under economic liberty, and this is what INSEAD found looking at El Salvador and how it was so successfully rebranded from the murder capital of the world to a place of hope and prosperity, Bitcoin was one of the two pillars of success of that transformation. The number one, of course, everybody knows about the security policy, has made El Salvador the most dangerous place in the entire world to the safest in the Western Hemisphere. But President Bukele's sort of leadership was that same sort of determination you see with security. He didn't back down. He kept going forward with determination. It wasn't enough to just take 10,000 gangs off the street. He took 70,000. Every single one of them was off the street, absolute security and peace in El Salvador for the first time in 50 years. The same thing with Bitcoin policy. It's like an economic liberty. It's like until we have total economic liberty and freedom and prosperity, then he's going to keep staying determined and moving forward.
Appreciate that. You've referred to him something as like a cross between many people, but a Steve Jobs sort of a leader. You just mentioned someone that comes along once every 500 years, someone that ushers in what Stacy, I think what you both refer to often as a new renaissance. Can we talk a little bit about the parallels to the original renaissance, to what's going on, and why money is at the center of, or it's like a prerequisite for a renaissance to occur, and why Bitcoin is that money this time around?
Well, I kind of came up with this on our podcast before we even met President Bukele, is that we predicted a Renaissance 2.0 would come because with Florence, when that became what happened there was they had the florin, right? Humans had used gold to trade for thousands of years by that point, but what the Medicis did, what Florence did, was create a perfect unit of account that was trusted everywhere around the world. So when a merchant from Florence traveled to North Africa and arrived in Medina to go trade somewhere for some spices or silks or whatever they were buying, the merchant there would give his best stuff to the merchant who had the florin. It was faster trade. Like, I want that one. I know what that is. I know the weight. I don't need to verify it as much as that's verified as good money. So they would take that, and then that obviously led to more success of that merchant going back to Florence and more wealth. So we saw that sort of effect could happen in El Salvador, and that is the sort of adoption that we have actually focused on, is the mind share of the best and brightest in the world, the best technologists, the best Bitcoiners, the best builders who would be attracted to El Salvador, who wanted to be part of this transformation, who were attracted by President Bukele's leadership and determination and his vision, and attracted by the best money. Because if you ever go to a Bitcoin conference and hang out at Bitcoin conferences, as you all do here, you understand the ethos and the mindset and the time preference and all those things that go into the culture of building that is part of Bitcoin. We knew, Max and I, when we came there, that as the first mover, we could attract the best and brightest and their mind share to El Salvador.
Yeah, as far as the Renaissance goes and the history of money, I've come to the conclusion that money is essentially a shared aesthetic, and it goes back 1,000,000 years. And in the Renaissance, by having the best money of the time, it attracted the artists, because money is a shared aesthetic, and it is a thing of beauty that it is supporting. Jim Simons, who was one of the greatest money managers ever, recently passed away. He said his first rule of making money is appreciate beauty. And Bitcoin is the Sistine Chapel of money. It's the most aesthetically beautiful form of money. So it's no surprise now that in El Salvador, you see what's happening to the historic downtown center. It's becoming gorgeous. The new library is aesthetically beautiful. And there's a huge call to be your best. And it touches everybody in the country, and you can feel it.
Appreciate that. Stacy, you just talked about the ethos that comes with Bitcoin, right? Truly understanding Bitcoin, what it can catalyze, right? Max, you've been telling the world about that since, 2010, right? You've been yelling about this. So you came in and then taught Bukele. You're a senior advisor to him. What was that process of him really coming to not just see Bitcoin as an opportunity to attract talent, but really starting to understand the ethos and incorporate that into his work as a leader? What has it been like speaking with him about this?
Well, like I said, President Bukele is a combination of like a Steve Jobs meets a JFK. And the Steve Jobs comparison is somebody who's incredibly focused on detail as well as having a vision, an aesthetic vision. And so when we arrived in the late 2021, we had a chance to meet with the president, and we explained what we thought the country should do. And he suggested we move there and be advisors. So that's what we did. But he was already completely on board. I would say, I believe he first mentioned Bitcoin in 2017. He was tweeting about it. And so he already was orange pilled, really. We didn't have any orange pilling to do. But the question of how to bring that to the nation state level, that was a question that needed to be solved.
Part of what solves that, I think, is education. Stacy, we spoke for a piece that I wrote for Bitcoin Magazine about the work the Bitcoin office does. Education is at the center of that, all the way from kindergarten all the way up to the university level. Can you talk a little bit about the programs that exist in El Salvador and how important they are?
Sure, and that's part of our first mover advantage, and it's a bit of a moat that we've established, is just time in the game, right? So for the past 2 years, we've been running a program combined with a Bitcoin Beach team and Me Premier Bitcoin in our high schools. So we've educated thousands and thousands of Salvadoran students on Bitcoin. But we've also introduced a program for some of the high schools. 50 of them have a Node Nation. So we're teaching them about setting up a full node and a Lightning node and also a Bitcoin miner. We're about to introduce in January a program for second and third graders of learning about money. I mean, it's not detailed into Bitcoin, but it does talk about Bitcoin in a way unique for second and third graders, and Lena Seish is involved with that, as well as Me Premier Bitcoin. We've educated 80,000 bureaucrats and civil servants in El Salvador through a program that, Max and I were the... we do the master class on that, and Giacomo Zucco and Plan B helped with the 3-day course on that. So that is our kind of moat, in that it takes as long as it takes to go down the rabbit hole. So we're training them not just on the technical matters of Bitcoin and that side of it, the engineering side. We're talking about the history, the philosophy, the ideology, the history of money, to all of these people, tens of thousands of people from second grade up into, working in the government. So it takes as long as it takes, and we're teaching them, and we're shifting mindsets in a way that we're 2 years at least ahead of everybody else.
That sort of shifting of mindset, you've both been doing this via the media forever, since Bitcoin has existed, essentially. When it comes to teaching, especially kids, about this, right? I think a lot of people say, like, Bitcoin is too difficult, kids can't, even adults can't grasp it, it's just too difficult. Can we counter that with the evidence that you've seen when it comes to, especially the elementary schools? What is it that eventually gets through to the kids? What is it that really gets them to sort of grasp it? What gets the light bulbs to go off?
Well, if you've met our Kubo Plus students, right? Kubo Plus is the Advanced Bitcoin and Lightning Devs program, and we started that a year and a half ago. We've graduated 21 of this very advanced. So it's a whole program that starts out with like 100 students, and it narrows down to 7 students who are sent to Europe. And again, for a wealthy country like the UAE, perhaps this is like ordinary. But for El Salvador, where it came from, in total, we've now sent 16 students to Europe to participate in Bitcoin conferences and further Bitcoin education there. And most of them, all but 2, had never even left El Salvador. So they went to Tuscany and Lugano in Switzerland, and they met people who were, astounded that they were from El Salvador. Wow, you're from El Salvador, Bitcoin country. And they started to look, in El Salvador, a lot of Salvadorans will tell us that it used to be an embarrassing place to come from, because this is a place you fled, and it was a small country, and it was a poor country, and it was a dangerous country, and they fled to America, and they wouldn't want to tell people they were from El Salvador. But now they got to that sort of mindset shift that President Bukele is always talking about. They got to be suddenly proud and say, like, wow, just Bitcoin did this, and President Bukele did this, and you can transform a nation just like that if you have a good leader.
Demographically, it's a lot harder to teach boomers about Bitcoin than it is kids. You know, older people tend to project their own incapability of learning new things onto kids, thinking like, well, if I can't get it, this kid can't get it. But of course, it's the opposite. You know, kids are open-minded, and they sense intuitively some of the aesthetic qualities of Bitcoin that I talked about, even though maybe they can't articulate it. They are still in tune with the nature to a greater degree than a cynical old bastard like myself. So I would say it's the opposite.
Fair enough. I remember when Milei was elected, I think you tweeted something like, we have to start this conversation with him. So what other leaders around the world are, maybe not, we don't have to get into sharing that. I'm sure you can't say that necessarily. But what are leaders asking, let's say, if they're getting in touch with you, they're getting in touch with maybe with Bukele to say, okay, what's working here, what's not working here? And also, what are the roadblocks for other leaders? I mean, it seems like El Salvador is this beautiful case study. Things are working, adoption is happening, you have these education programs. It seems like, well, why doesn't everyone else just follow suit? What seems to be the struggle for other leaders around the world who are sort of paying attention but maybe can't implement things the same way?
I think, so we're not going into any specifics yet, but I think the most important thing for El Salvador is that we are part of the world conversation. We're part of the story. We're part of the narrative at a really pivotal moment in history, and that is just so unheard of and unthought of before President Bukele existed in El Salvador as the leader, right? So it hadn't ever happened to be a place where El Salvador was part of the conversation. But El Salvador, yesterday on Fox News, we were watching the news here in the room, and El Salvador is being talked about on Fox News, right?
Just about the bond, where they're saying like El Salvador's a good country to invest in, I think.
No. So what they were saying on Fox News is Giancarlo, the guy who was the head of the CFTC and now might be in the Trump administration, he was talking about Elon Musk's tweet about El Salvador and our strategic Bitcoin reserve, that how impressive it was. So again, this is just so unheard of, and it's hard to maybe transmit to, at this sort of Bitcoin conference, you're going to have a lot of very wealthy people, but in a country that's very poor and was not part of the global conversation, to be part of the global conversation whereby the richest man in the world is talking about how impressive your strategic reserve is just, it's a rapid transformation in the outcome and the experience of being Salvadoran and being from El Salvador.
Yeah, I mean, the element of Bitcoin, of FOMO, fear of missing out, has reached the nation-state level and the sovereign wealth fund level, central bank level, and it's the same on that level as it is on any level. I think Warren Buffett said once that people are not that interested really in making money until their neighbor starts making money, all right? And then suddenly, it's keeping up with the Joneses. So the fact that a couple of countries are now stacking and showing great results as a result has triggered FOMO at the highest level. I remember when I did a .com company in Los Angeles back in the late 90s, and we got a huge investment from NBC, the media company. And I asked one of the executives, why did you invest in my company? And he said, to tell you the truth, I don't know, but I don't want to miss it. Okay. And that was the mentality at that time. So we've entered that phase of the cycle where people are just going to be writing enormous checks because they don't want to miss it. And we'll take the money.
That's fair. That's fair. For other countries that adopt this, so El Salvador came in while the price was relatively high back a few years ago and then survived this whole bear market, and you did the real work that needed to be done, education programs, training developers. But they had both of you, and both of you are, catalysts. You're both there to really support this. Do you ever worry that maybe because both of you won't exist in other countries, the adoption rate won't be as quick, or people won't, adapt to it as quickly?
I did always say that. I said that on the Bitcoin conference 2 years ago, I think, in Miami. I said, there won't ever be another Bitcoin country because there won't be another Max and Stacy in these countries. And the thing is, and a President Bukele. Okay, he's a 1 in 500 year type leader. But the important thing is that there's a steep learning curve. Okay, first of all, El Salvador was told the two pillars of their rebrand were security and Bitcoin policy. It's now a case study from INSEAD. both of them, it's really important to understand, global institutions and global important media on both of those items, those two pillars of President Bukele's program, where it said these are impossible and they cannot be done. You will not succeed. They all said that. They said that about his security regime. At first they called him a dictator and they said it's impossible. You're going to crash your economy. A certain global institution told them that you're going to crash your economy if you lock up the gangsters. And he continued, determined, moving forward. The same thing with Bitcoin. And now it's transforming global geopolitics. Argentina is adopting our security policy. Our security policy became a big issue in the U.S. election. And many Americans are saying, well, if President Bukele can turn his country around, surely we could turn around Philadelphia and Baltimore and San Francisco and all the cities of America. The same thing with Bitcoin is like, everybody said it wasn't possible, and now we proved it worked. And I think that El Salvador was able to prove it works is the reason why it's now being openly talked about as a Bitcoin strategic reserve in the U.S. as well.
Yeah, Bitcoin demonetizes violence, and this is in part of why the security model in El Salvador has been so successful, because the mindset of Bitcoin is a demonetization of violence. It monetizes peace and love. And the hardest thing about Bitcoin adoption on the sovereign level is to keep out everything else, because every single thing else out there that might get into your country and start mucking about dilutes the brand value, it dilutes the impact of Bitcoin, and you will delay achieving what you can achieve if you are Bitcoin only, Bitcoin maximalist. And this is something that we've done at the Bitcoin office that has been probably the most challenging aspect of the role, is to create that moat, create that perimeter. You know, during the whole Celsius period and FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried, none of that stink got into El Salvador. Not a single person suffered from all of that hellacious shitcoining, because we made it a point to make sure that the people of El Salvador were protected from that.
Part of that is, you know, the
following... Give a round of applause. We could clap for that. Yeah.
The greatest rebrand in history has happened in El Salvador, and is driven entirely by one person, and that is President Bukele. He's a 1 in 500 year type leader, and we were, from the very beginning, for 3 years, we were very clear on all of our understanding about the fact that it's President Bukele and his vision driving this change and the transformation. So if you suddenly introduce an equal co-partner that you have no say over, and they're becoming wealthier than you, the nation, whatever, like all the 5 million other tokens that exist outside of Bitcoin, like suddenly you have a partner that you have no say over. If you had into such an economy in a small, total new rebrand and a transformation, our situation is unique. Maybe the United States is a giant, huge $30 trillion economy versus our $30 billion one, and can maybe tolerate many founders of other tokens. But for El Salvador, it had to be like very clear and focused and on a vision of economic liberty that the president wanted to introduce. So there's no number two next to him that is outside the country, living somewhere else, traveling around the world, becoming wealthier as the coin rises because of your adoption of that. So we are very focused on just being excellence only, the number one only, the best only, because that's how a small country asymmetrically can catapult up to the top. And it has succeeded, because we're in our hotel room and watching Fox News, and there we are being talked about, right?
It's pretty stellar to watch. One last question, and we're wrapping up here. So you have someone now like Maya Parpo running for president of Suriname, saying she wants to put the country on a Bitcoin standard. Just maybe a piece of advice to other leaders, not just her per se, but other leaders who may be, and especially from what gets termed the Global South, a term I have mixed feelings about, but other Latin American leaders from maybe smaller countries. What advice would you give if you're going to run on a pro-Bitcoin platform?
President Bukele has made it easy, because everybody wants to look like him. Everybody wants to be as popular as him. His popularity rating, he's the number one most popular leader in the world,
right? 93%.
Yeah, everybody wants to be like that. So they look at him and he adopted Bitcoin and he provided security. Well, let's do that.
Yeah, the El Salvador success, there's actually a playbook that you can follow. There were 5 or 6 key steps that were taken. And we don't, in 25 seconds, we don't have time to review them. But it's an actual step-by-step guide to achieving the same type of success. And I recommend any country that wants to compete with El Salvador on the stage of global excellence to study the playbook.
As Max just said, we are running a little bit low on time here. What I would love for everyone to do, Stacy and Max have been doing this for a long time. They've been doing this at the first Bitcoin conferences, 2010? Was that the first? 2011?
2011.
10? Yeah, so please, I would love a standing ovation for these two and what they've done in El Salvador. Actual standing up out of your seat. So thank you very much, and I appreciate you guys joining us here.
And welcome to the Bitcoin Club, UAE. And happy birthday.
Is your company ready for the next evolution in financial strategy? Bitcoin for Corporations is your partner in securing the future of your business. With exclusive membership benefits, our comprehensive masterclass, and a network of trusted service providers, we provide the insights and resources to help you incorporate Bitcoin into your financial strategy, ensuring stability and long-term value. Strengthen your business. Innovate with confidence. Bitcoin for Corporations, protecting your treasury and positioning you for the future.